I'm very, very pleased to have this guest, a name that will sound very, very familiar to anyone listening. I'm here with Frodi Midjord. And if you're aware of that name, you'll know that he is the creator of Guide to Culture, available at guidingthestorm.com. He's also the founder of the Scandza Forum, rather, which we'll be talking about a lot today. And similarly, the Decameron Film Festival, which recently wrapped up its 2023 year, and also host of the weekly Roundup with Mark Webber, which I typically watch on Odyssey. I think it might be on Rumble as well. Would that be correct?
Yeah, we're also on Rumble. I sort of have that as a backup or something. We don't have a lot of views on Rumble, so it's not our primary channel. It's sort of yeah. I just want to be there because other people are there. But Odyssey is probably the
Same thing with
primary.
me.
Yeah.
Like I was a huge fan of Odyssey for a long time. I'm not sure Odyssey will last much longer. Everyone's been predicting it'll fall, so I've got a Rumble as well. Again, I haven't been pitching it to people for the longest time, so there's nothing on there. But I know a good friend of mine, Tyler Hamilton, who runs the Rupture Network. Him and a bunch of other guys. Jefferson Lee and Josh Neal and them, they're part of the same network, and they just lost their YouTube, something north of 7,000 subscribers. And so you have to start all over again on Rumble, and it's not easy for people. And so I recommend people start now because it just sucks. It's just a slow build. And I don't know if it'll ever replace YouTube for ease of access, but, you know, I just want to find one platform that I can stay at where I don't need to leave every year and a half. But I don't know if that exists.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. I don't know either what's going to happen with Odyssey. It seems that their parent company or the library that used to own Odyssey had a trial or a court case. So they sort of disappeared, but it seems that Odyssey split away from them, and maybe Odyssey has a new owner now, and we don't really know who that is, so we don't really know what's going to happen with it. But I think it's a great platform. I've enjoyed it. I think it works well, typically, and so I hope it's going to last.
Yeah, me too. I'm putting a lot of eggs in this basket of I don't know who owns it. I don't know what's going on with it. I get people who send me donations. That money is still there. And if it goes down, that money is just gone. So I don't know. I hope it stays up because I actually don't know how to withdraw those funds. They're just hanging out on Odyssey. One thing I wanted to mention before we get too into it was you this year celebrated, I believe it was the 10th conference of the Scandza Forum in Tallinn. And I really wanted to talk about that because I am deeply fascinated with the live events that are occurring in our broad political space. There's a few people who are doing a lot of events in North America, but I think when I think of live events, I think of the Scandza Forum because these go back to 2015, I believe. And so you're the one that I believe has been doing it the longest among the ones that are still doing it. And I was curious, with that experience under your belt, like how in your opinion, has it changed much since you started? Have you learned anything? And also, I noticed that you held it in a smaller town, whereas most people would have events in big metropolitan areas. And I was just curious what you thought, but was there a reason behind that? And would you recommend that to other events?
Yeah, I guess we've been going for a long time. Of course, in America, things like AmRen have been going on since the 1990s. But yeah, we've been going since 2015. It wasn't called the Scandza Forum in 2015, but that was the first time I organized a conference. I think this is the 10th or 11th event that I had, which took place in May earlier this year. Like you said, it was in Tallinn, Estonia. And I guess there are several reasons for that. Eastern Europe is not as damaged by the civilizational collapse. They're sort of moving in the opposite direction. The first time I went to the Baltic states more than 20 years ago, and it was still, suffering from a hangover from the sort of Soviet occupation was still very much hit by poverty, and you could see all of those effects. Whereas now it is, at or above Scandinavian standards. So it's a beautiful place for, especially, if people travel all the way from America and so on. I wanted to show Europe from its best side. So I guess there were several reasons for choosing that. Also, I like, small. It's a capital city, so it's not a tiny little town, but it's a capital city of a small country. So it has everything you need. But I just thought it was a nice location. We were very lucky with the weather and everything, so it was just like a very nice weekend. And those events are not just about the speeches and the intellectual content, although that is, of course, important, but it's also about socializing and networking and people just having a chance to hang out. I mean, we are living in a sort of a very globalized time where we talk to people on different continents and different countries and so on. And so I think it's important to have these opportunities to meet IRL, face to face. And I think that is perhaps the central or the major purpose of these international conferences.
Well, what's interesting is that I think I've heard Edward Dutton say something similar about Eastern Europe broadly, that it's a good place to go for the dissident minded Westerner. And I've heard something similar from a guest we had on recently named Liquid Swan, and he's taken the North American perspective, and he said, and I'm in Canada, so he was talking about, if you had to commit an exodus, where would you go to leave the system, regroup, and maybe re-enter it? And so a lot of North Americans are even looking at South America, areas of South America, where they could maybe breathe a bit easier, have less of a foot over their throat to discuss things. And I was curious about the location you picked, and some of the others. I think people have talked about Bulgaria as one option. Do you see it staying this way for long? If it is a place where you can host these sorts of events and you can access perhaps a higher standard of living and a more untouched or unmolested form of European living. Do you see that being targeted at some point in the future? What do you? I know that's a speculative question, but I'm curious about what you think.
Well, that's a good question. That's an interesting question. And, both yes and no. There are efforts to uh, multiculturalize Eastern Europe. Of course, Hungary is a well-known example from the mass media, is often talking about Hungary because Hungary is resisting globalization or resisting mass immigration, EU mass immigration policies, and so on. The EU is withholding money from Hungary because Hungary does not comply with all the directives, the orders from the EU and other sort of international bodies to accept mass immigration the same way that the Western Europe has. So, in a sense, there is an effort through international organizations and institutions like the EU and so on to push for Westernization of Eastern European countries. And some of them have made serious steps in that direction. But at the same time, the silver lining, I guess, of the civilizational clash that we're seeing now between the West and NATO and Russia is that the border countries sort of they see the reality of this struggle because, of course, the Baltic states and the other countries in Eastern Europe, they were occupied by the Soviet Union and by Russia only 30 years ago. So they are very conscious of their national identity and the fact that you actually have to fight for your national identity, that nothing is given to you for free, and so on. So they're very much aware of that. And also, there have been, in the Cold War and so on, there were, and afterwards, there have been efforts also by the West to sort of look the other way or somewhat encourage a national feeling in those Eastern European countries, because they are sort of a buffer zone between the West and Russia. And so there's this bizarre inversion of rhetoric between the West and Russia when talking about Eastern Europe, because Russia, with Russia Today and so on, they will criticize the West and saying that your leaders have abandoned you. They have opened up the doors for mass immigration. They're replacing you, and so on, criticizing that. Well, at the same time, when they talk about Eastern Europe, they will say you're Nazi. You don't accept immigration. You don't accept these sort of international values, and so on. And the West does exactly the same thing in reverse, of course, saying that the Western countries should accept mass immigration, for example, whereas Eastern European countries, it's very important that they remain what they are, that they defend their national sovereignty, and so on. So my point here is that with regard to Eastern Europe, there's great hypocrisy, both on the Russian side and on the Western side. So I think they have sort of indirectly been given a free pass, at least for now. But at the same time, there are efforts as well to make them sort of westernized in that respect, with mass immigration and so on. So I guess we'll see. Seems like Poland is now being liberalized. There's a lot of pressure on Hungary to comply with EU mass immigration. The Baltic states are still very good, but they're very small countries. And of course, with very small countries, it doesn't take so much to change them dramatically. A country like America, for example, with 350 million people, it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time to change it completely. Whereas a country with 1.5 million people, like a small Baltic country, it doesn't take all that much to transform it drastically. So they're vulnerable at the same time.
That's a very comprehensive answer. And I was going to get to this a bit later, but I guess we'll get into it now because it's very interesting that I'll start by saying that within our space, within our political milieu, you've taken a bit of I wouldn't call it an anti-Russian stance, but at the very least a Russia skeptic stance, which for a time, especially last year, was not popular in this space. And I remember I saw you on Millennial last year, and I was looking through the comment section, and everyone's like, this guy's so wrong about Russia. This guy's so got the wrong idea, because there's a lot of people in the space, when looking at the Russia-Ukraine war, were vehemently pro-Russia, because to them, Russia represented anti-imperialism or anti-Zog. There's a bunch of different names, but they were electing Russia as sort of almost like a populist hero against Western imperialism. But we on the show have always taken a pretty, when I say amoral, I just mean, non-sensationalist, sort of neo-realist stance. And over the course of the past year, we covered a lot of neo-realist books like The Heartland Theory by Halford Mackinder and Hans Morgenthau, and kind of looking at the geopolitical realities of that region. And in fact, I'm publishing an article in the Vanguardist Journal soon that really summarizes a lot of this. Point being that Eastern Europe presents a very fascinating sort of tract of land on the globe that, even though it's been hotly contested for centuries, people don't really look at it like that. They just keep wondering why Ukraine keeps getting invaded. In fact, we had covered the rise of Ukrainian nationalism. This would have been last year. We covered this book called Gates of Europe. That's pretty interesting about the history of Ukraine going back to the Rus and then right up until the present day, and following that intellectual movement. Because a lot of people think like Ukrainian nationalism is like a spook by the American government, and it's not, right? But that's why I find that stuff interesting. And I look at it when we talk about what's going on in Eastern Europe. I always try and tell people, like, don't view Russia as your friend. Like, you kind of gave a good example there, where Russia will say one thing like, "Oh, these are the good guys here." It's like, no, they're calling everyone Nazis too. They're advocating for mass migration too. They're doing, like, they're not that different than America in their geopolitical goals. And this entire pivot area is always kind of being pulled into the gravitational pulls of east versus west. And that's what I find interesting. It's been happening for, like I said, centuries. And watching the nationalist movement, some of them are organic, some of them are surely funded from the outside, like all nationalist movements are at one point or another. But that's, I'm just kind of expressing where we come from, where we're not the vehemently pro-Russian people, and I think people ought to treat Russia with skepticism at the very least. And I was wondering if you wanted to go into that a bit more specifically, because I know from where you hail from, I think a lot of people look at Russia from a North American perspective, and they don't look at Russia from the perspective of its neighbor, of someone that might be geographically closer to Russia and have a far different history with that, Eurasian landmass. And I was wondering if you'd like to maybe dive into what it's been like taking that perception within the broad dissident right, and maybe just explain your thoughts on that. I know I just gave you a lot of stuff there, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that is a good question, and it's been an important, the central topic over the last 2 years almost, since Russia invaded Ukraine on a full scale invasion on February 24th. 2022. Of course, by that time, it had already been going on, the conflict or the war in eastern Ukraine, for 8 years. So we're now talking about 10 years. And so it didn't really start 2 years ago. I think that's important to keep in mind as well. But it did dramatically change 2 years ago. I think the reactions are understandable, although it's been frustrating to deal with some of the reactions, because a lot of right-wing thought and sort of the remnants, or the heirs of the alt-right and sort of the online, the e-right, or whatever you want to call it, is sort of grievance politics, or grievance talking points. It's sort of, people are angry, and it's not very constructive usually. A lot of the talk is kind of destructive, really. They want to criticize things, and the American point of view, from my perspective, has been a lot of navel gazing. They've been talking about the war in Ukraine, but they haven't been talking about Ukraine. They've been talking about America, but the war is in Ukraine. And so, when people talk about a war in Ukraine on the other side of the planet, and then they just talk about sort of American politics, it's sort of like they just want to say, screw you, Dad, to their own government, and they don't really care about the actual war. So you have to sort of take this seriously as a war, as a real. This is not a theoretical discussion. This is an actual war with hundreds of thousands of casualties. So that is an important thing. Of course, there is a difference in perspective between Europe and America when it comes to this war, because from a European perspective, it's very immediate. The threat of this war is very immediate. 30 years ago, Russia occupied half of Europe during the Cold War. And all those countries that were occupied, more or less all those countries that were occupied by Russia, they wanted some sort of security against aggression from Russia, or against future occupation or something like that. And so they wanted to join NATO. So they've been banging on NATO's door because they wanted to escape that sphere. And of course, so now when Russia attacked and invaded 2 years ago, the biggest country in Europe, and the biggest of those countries that were previously occupied by Russia, that is a very dramatic thing. It's the biggest war since the end of the Second World War. It's the most dramatic event in our time. And so for Americans on the other side of the Atlantic, it can seem like a not very important issue, whereas in Europe, it's very immediate, especially in Eastern Europe, because those countries were just recently, and I mean 30 years in geopolitical terms is a very short period of time. And so when that war started, it was a very dramatic event. And of course, it motivated both Sweden and Finland to join NATO. And of course, Russia is now alienated from Europe more than it was before. And uh, this has it's had many effects, but what I want to say is that for Americans it might seem like this is nothing to do with us, and that might be true because of course Ukraine is not a part of America. It's not a neighboring country to America, but America is part of NATO, and so it is very much affected by a war that is right on NATO's border, especially when it's a big war like this. It can't be compared to some smaller little conflict somewhere. This is a major, major event, and what it really is it's about prestige for the Russian Empire and the Western Empire, America, NATO, and so on. Of course, for Russia, it is very important to not show weakness, or they have to sort of save face, because these other countries that used to be under their umbrella have walked the other way. They're pretty hostile to Russia, and they are doing better than Russia. Financially speaking, they're better off. Ukraine sees this, that these countries, the Baltic states, Poland, and so on, they're doing better, and Ukraine is still very much poor, very much part of this sort of very kind of authoritarian or corrupt culture that is part of the Russian tradition. I don't want to be too critical of that culture because it has an explanation in the fact that Russia is a huge country. Russia can never be sort of a democratic state in the type of sort of Western Europe. It can never be that. But the point is that the Ukrainians, so they want to travel along the same path as many of these other countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union and are now part of NATO, and they're actually doing better. And that's a threat to Russia, because for Russia it is humiliating. It's humiliating when your former partners want to go the other way and sort of leave you behind, and it's not a good look. So they have to step in, and so they attacked. From a Western European perspective, of course, this is not something that you can just dismiss or you can just look the other way, because this is the biggest country in Europe that is being invaded and attacked by Russia. And for America, it's about NATO, of course, because in the global civilizational struggle between empires, strength is important and weakness is extremely dangerous. So if you see something like this happen and you don't respond forcefully, then that's a sign of weakness, and other countries are going to see that as a sign of weakness, and they are not going to be reluctant about exploiting that weakness. So it's, of course, very dangerous. So for America, it is mostly about getting Russia to spend a lot of resources in Ukraine, weakening Russia as a rival power, but also defending or living up to its obligations as a NATO country. Because if America and NATO and the West fail to show its teeth when something like this happens, then that's going to be seen as a clear sign of weakness by the rest of the world, and that's going to be a very dangerous situation. So for both sides, really, this is about saving face from the global geopolitical point of view. And of course, for Europeans, it is there's a lot of frustration and grievance in Eastern Europe because of the previous relationship with Russia. So this is, I can understand that it is. I can understand that it's a different thing for Europeans and Americans, but it's an issue that shouldn't be lightly dismissed.
Yeah, I was always interested in whether or not the Russian interest in Eastern Europe was more of a perennial issue, because there's this great book by John Ladon called The Russian Empire in the World. That was tracking the era of Russian imperialism from 1700 right up until the First World War. And this ties into heartland theory and the geopolitical aspect we were talking about before, which is again amoral. It's not trying to assign a bad guy or a good guy. It's not trying to address who started what. It's saying here are the territorial realities, and that Russia might have a consistent interest in having, and this is where Finland would come in, having better access to the Baltic Sea, or in the case of Ukraine, not so much anymore because of I think Russia extends there, but having better access to the Black Sea and therefore Turkey. And they said that was what inspired a lot of Russian expansion in the past. And you had mentioned a good point there about the Russian mind or the Russian civilization, which is very distinct from the Western or European civilization. I think a lot of people recognize that, but in this book specifically, I think you trace the history of the Russian mind as sort of the synthesis of, on one hand, the Byzantine Empire, on the other hand, the golden horde of Genghis Khan, which isn't like an insult in any way. It's just a very distinct sort of background, which is not shared by France or Spain. But that's why, Finland might be more concerned about this than France, and why, Latvia, Lithuania, all these other Eastern European countries, I was always wondering like how much of a danger do they see Russia? Not even as, because, the story that they tell in the West is that Putin, and I was reading an article just the other day, and I'm going to cover it for the paywall show that I do, but it was an article written in, I think, a Tablet magazine, and it was like against John Mearsheimer, who's all been out there saying like, look, there's a straight geopolitical calculus you could run for why Russia is interested in Ukraine and why Russia would try and push back against NATO, whatever it might be. But he was saying that that the narrative is that Putin's just insane. That he's just an insane Hitler. Like everyone has to come back to Hitler. There's just a whole row of Hitlers throughout history, and then sometimes there's just a crazy asshole who takes charge, and we have to take control. We have to get that crazy asshole. Whereas everyone else is like, okay, maybe there's a more complicated reason why this might be happening, which I think you accurately just outlined there. But you always have to tiptoe around this stuff very fast because people get very invested and passionate about this topic. Although, and I'm wondering what you think about this, it's kind of interesting how the Ukraine war has been shuffled off of the headlines recently. Like no one over here in Canada or the US, as far as I know, is really talking about the war anymore. It's still going on, but we just found other stuff to talk about. And that's just an interesting world to live in. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot of important stuff there. And one of the things is that, just about the nature of Russian politics. Putin is not some crazy guy. He's not insane. That's not why he's doing this. This is the nature of it's the nature of imperial politics. It's the nature of global politics. It's sort of like bullies in the schoolyard. They have to kind of face off against each other every now and then to prove their strength. And it's sort of like we are we are primitive creatures beneath the surface, right? And power sort of has a life of its own. And if you have an empire, you are going to be challenged by the countries around your border. Russia is an enormous country. I think it used to have 11 time zones. I think they've sort of rationalized it down to 8 time zones now. That just tells you, gives you a little hint of how enormous it is. It's a huge country. Of course, it's not as densely populated as Western Europe or as America is. Of course, many places in North America is also not very densely populated. But Russia is a thing in itself. It's a civilization in itself, and it's huge. You cannot rule a large country like that with the same kind of political mentality that you rule Denmark or Finland, with this kind of social democratic liberal democracy. You have to have a sort of an authoritarian mindset, because otherwise it falls apart. And also, you have to show your muscles sometimes, because it's sort of like if you have all the resources. I read uh, Daniel Defoe. He wrote a book under pseudonym about pirates. I forget what it's called. I think he wrote it under the name Captain Johnson or something. And he wrote about this captain who every once in a while he just shot a member of the crew just to show that he could. Just to show his muscles and put the fear of God into the crew members so that they wouldn't rebel. And if you have an empire, you sort of have to flex your muscles. You cannot take any crap from anyone, because then it's dangerous. Then the rest, the vultures will pounce on you immediately. But the problem is that goes for Russia, and it goes for the West. It goes for the Western countries and America. And of course, America isn't secure in its position either, because Russia is a growing power. China is a growing power. Russia is now more or less playing second fiddle to China's empire. So the point is that this is not some sort of irrational, crazy idea that sometimes these wars happen. It is simply the nature of power. That's how these empires work. And there will be conflict. Conflict is a part of human societies. It's a part of human history. It's a part of human nature. And it's sort of interesting to see that these sort of right-wing thinkers, supposedly in the West, have taken this really extremely liberal view on this war. It's sort of like war is not a reality we have to deal with. It's just something that the evil neocons do, or something, or on the other side of the fence is just crazy Hitler Putin. No, it's not. War and global conflict is a part of human society, and it is what it is. It's Carl Schmitt, the political scientist or political theorist, he sort of defined, or he talked about liberalism as this idea that you can transcend politics, you can transcend the friend-enemy distinction, and you can just, do business, have polite bourgeois conversations, and sort of politics and conflict and war. That's a thing of the past. That's what primitive people do. And we civilized modern people, we are just individuals, and we can participate in business enterprises and free trade and these things. And it's very interesting that is sort of how the Tucker Carlsons and the sort of American conservatives have seen this as, well, this is just a situation that I can opt out of, because Putin is not a bad guy. And, it's like this good guy, bad guy narrative. And so they've become sort of this sort of true believer in that liberal idea that you can just opt out of politics. No, this is a global conflict where, it doesn't matter if you want to see yourself as part of a group, your enemy is going to see you as part of a group. And so if Russia wages war on the West, that means you. If you are in the West, it doesn't matter what you think, if you want to or not. It's sort of like, Tucker Carlson says he doesn't want to be considered white. He just wants to be an individual. It doesn't matter. Other people are going to see you as white. You're going to be white. It doesn't matter what you think. And so
Exactly.
it's sort of, yeah. And so I've just seen a lot of those same tendencies with respect to the response to this war that I've seen to, how liberals react to racial issues and so on. They just want to close their eyes, or they want to look the other way and pretend it doesn't happen, doesn't exist. No, this is a real situation, and it's a very serious situation. It's the most dangerous situation since the end of the Second World War. It's more dangerous than the Cold War, and we have to take it seriously. And I think more and more people are waking up to the actual fact that, well, it's not just a war in eastern Ukraine. There's also a war between the West and Russia. Sweden just uncovered the biggest espionage affair in all of Sweden's history, on behalf of the GRU, the Russian military intelligence. two Iranians had infiltrated the Swedish security service and leaked the list of employees of the military intelligence and the Swedish police security service. And it's just all these things are intensifying in a time of war. And of course, America is infiltrating Russia. Russia is infiltrating the West with paid agents or with propaganda. Propaganda is a big part of warfare. I just want to say one more thing before I hand over the microphone back to you. But it's sort of like I've seen these people who say that we're looking at a nuclear war. It's going to be a nuclear war that's coming, but they dismiss the possibility of a propaganda war. They say that no, that Russia is not engaging in any propaganda war. They're not infiltrating anything. They're not spreading a propaganda through media and social media and so on. They dismiss that as paranoid delusions, but they think that a nuclear war is likely. So, I mean, a propaganda war surely comes a few steps before there is a nuclear war. So I think people have just been pretty irrational about this whole situation.
Yeah, you said a couple of really important things there, and I want to just add on to that when you'd mentioned the infiltration by Russia and Iran. In Canada, we're dealing with that right now too, and a lot of those nations, the BRICS nations, are in various concerts and leagues. Within Canada, we're dealing with China. We cover this on our show through a series of articles and books that paint a very grim picture of how the Canadian government and the Canadian business sector has been infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party in a couple of different forms. One is through organized crime, and one is through the Communist Party itself. And the story of that is long, and I won't get into it right now. But basically, long story short, with Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who's a former prime minister, he actually very aggressively brokered a deal with Maoist China when Mao was still alive, because Canada just wanted its own trade deal with China to kind of like stick it to the Americans. And that started a relationship with China that continues to this day. And the entire Canadian apparatus has been infiltrated by Chinese student groups, which are very popular in communist societies for infiltration, actual just paid agents, but most importantly is the triads. And to start, you have to understand that the Hong Kong triads work hand in glove with the Chinese Communist Party. There is no real separation between these international cartels and the Communist Party. Oftentimes, they meet together, and the big story is that the Chinese triads from the 90s up until now were responsible for something like 95% of fentanyl production in North America. So if anyone knows about someone who's got a problem with fentanyl, that's because the fucking Chinese Communist Party was directly involved. How do we know this? Well, because the triads would have to synthetically make it in factories that were owned by the Chinese government. So they're, once again, working hand in glove with theirs. So point being that the infiltration in Canada can occur through money laundering, underground banks, and also, and this will lead to the point you had just talked about, novel forms of warfare. And this is something we're going to once again talk about in my article. But when people think about warfare, they think of a hot war, troops on the ground and whatnot. And that, of course, that's still in play. But when we talk about fourth generational warfare, fifth generational warfare, we talk about, inspiring convenient color revolutions and subversions in societies. One of them is neurological warfare. One of them is, think how much easier it is to subvert a nation if like 10, 15% of them are hooked on drugs. And they're not only causing confusion within that country, but they're also a giant financial burden. That would be advantageous for any country if you could get half of your target country hooked on something. And there's this very fascinating book that we covered on the show. It was a collection of essays written by various academics. The book's called Neurotechnology and National Security and Defense. Advances in Neurotechnology, Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues. This is just a book written by a bunch of academics for a military audience. And what they're saying is, look, the new frontier in warfare is neurotechnology. It's using microchips and whatnot to boost cognitive abilities, or introducing new types of weapons that can slow down or inhibit target countries' function capacity. So one interesting way to look at that would be something like Dune, if anyone knows Dune, the Mentats, because in the Dune universe, there's no AI and there's no advanced technology like that. So what they do is they make human operators function like computers, and so that is one. And this entire book was them these various philosophers and analysts and like, look, this is coming. We need to get ahead of it because the military doesn't have a grasp on this anymore. It used to be that the military would develop technology, then maybe roll it out to civilian use. Is like now it's being developed by the government at the exact same time as the private sector, just like drones. Drones were developed by the military and just regular companies at about the exact same time. They're like, we need to get a handle on this because we're starting to fuck around with people's mental faculties and boosting their awareness. Anyway, roundabout way to say that the book is essentially saying that within this new theater of warfare, every single civilian is in play. Every single civilian of whatever the nation is, they are a target for not only just propaganda, but maybe you want to roll out synthetic drugs. Maybe you want to introduce a neurotoxin into the water. You can do that. And anything short of like burning bodies or shooting people is seen as morally superior. And just to, I'm giving you a lot here, but it sounds conspiratorial, but it's not really. There's, everyone knows the American government has interest in this. There was this great book called Lab 257 that was tracking throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the American government's interest in developing new types of, diseases and things like that, because think of it from their perspective. Wouldn't it be great to win a war if no one had to get shot? Wouldn't it be great to win a war if no bodies had to be burned? Well, how do you do that? Well, a great way to do it would be to make everyone real sick for a little bit, or making them real confused with some kind of gas that doesn't, cause their brains to melt out of their head. So whether or not they succeeded, you could understand from a liberal humanist perspective why scientists would want to do this, because in their minds they're solving war. However, it opens the gate to what we have here, which is the development of novel neurotoxins, or like, well, anything's better than being shot in the face, even if it's debilitating an entire nation. And then there's rumors that that's what COVID was. I don't even want to get into that, but you could understand very realistically why this new theater of war would be, everyone's involved. You're involved. I'm involved. It's all propaganda. It's all, you got to think very three-dimensionally about how war could be conducted in the future. Now, I gave you a lot to chew on there. What do you think of all that?
No, I think those are important points. One of the problems in the West is the mass psychosis after the Second World War, which made people think that things like eugenics is an evil thing, something that we should not engage in. But the Chinese, for example, they're not as squeamish about those topics, right? And if you engage in eugenic practices for your population for a couple of generations while the other population engages in dysgenics, is going to give you a pretty good head start if there's a conflict and if there's competition, resource competition, or weapons race or whatever, right? So things like that Europeans don't take seriously, because for whatever reason they think that things like eugenics is not something we should deal with, which I think is sort of a remnant of Christian thought, that it's evil you shouldn't play God or whatever. But the point is, this is a practice that exists in nature. We should try to direct it to make the most use of it. Other civilizations, like China, for example, they take it very seriously. And when it comes to war and propaganda war, one of the things now is social media. And social media, this is something that I've been commenting on a little bit. I probably should be talking more about it, is that social media is even more dangerous for the purposes of disinformation and so on, the social media is even more dangerous and more powerful than old media. It's sort of like the difference between watching a movie and playing a video game. If you are interactive, if you are doing the things that the character is doing, then you are a part of the story and you believe in it more. It goes deeper. And the same way, if you believe that this is just an organic conversation rather than, the big corporations speaking down to you, you think that this is just an organic conversation that's going on between normal citizens, and everyone thinks this or everyone thinks that, then it is going to be much more powerful for brainwashing. Because, like I talked about recently on one of my shows, that the way propaganda works is through artificial peer pressure. It's not through arguments, it's not through logic, it's through artificial peer pressure. You create an artificial environment, and there you create the impression that everyone thinks this, and then everyone will go along with that. All the high status people think this, and everyone will go along with that, because 99.99% of all people, they will not start to look at all the facts, read up on all the books, and analyze the logical arguments and infer through deduction and so on to reach a conclusion. They will look at what is everyone else doing. And so that's exactly what was happening also with the propaganda war that started on social media and everywhere else when this war broke out 2 years ago, is that all of a sudden, all these new accounts started flooding social media with the exact same talking points, and people started copying the talking points. It's sort of like people were swept up by the hive mind, and they were, well, this is what you're supposed to think now. And so they started saying those things. So a lot of people are sort of conspiratorial, think that, well, this person has been bought or that person has been bought. I don't think so. I think it's more group psychology. If you create the impression that this is what your group is thinking, then that's going to work. Then most people are just going to go along with that, because most people don't have the time or the ability to actually look at the facts themselves. And of course, America is hijacking or influencing the internal dissidents in Russia, just as Russia is trying to hijack or influence the internal dissidents or the internal political opposition in the West. And of course, we are the political opposition. And the point that I've been trying to make in so many words is that, well, if we are the political opposition in the West and we want to make a credible case that we should look out for our countries, then perhaps we shouldn't be hijacked to spread disinformation on behalf of a hostile enemy nation in a wartime. Maybe that's not the most credible, most brilliant thing to do.
And that's something that I've advocated for on the show pretty regularly, where it's like, even if our interests momentarily align with another group, another nation, don't make the mistake of thinking that you're allies. And one issue that I come back to, and this will lead into the next point I wanted to talk about, which is, but on our side, in our political milieu, let's just say Westerners, let's just say those of European descent. I'll just say white Canadians in my case. We're not actually very good for advocating for our own self-interests or identifying what our self-interests actually are. So we play this sort of fandom game by thinking like, well, I'm a dissident, I'm a nationalist, so I'm going to side with every other dissident force, or I'm just going to be open to whoever is open to me, which means that we can just be wielded however. But we don't have a lock on what our actual interests are. And so we can always just be used and abused by whatever sovereign force is trying to use us against, oftentimes against our own self-interest. And I think you had presented an interesting solution to this, and you had written quite a bit about this. And there's several videos on your Odyssey that I had watched in the past about this, about the concept of retribalization. And I think that's one way for people to start building what are your actual self-interests? What's your group? What's good for you and your survival, instead of getting too lost in these very heady, abstract sort of geopolitical wars that you think, like, for example, like if I'm not trying to take a stand here, but like if Palestine, on the issue of Israel versus Palestine, people have their the horse they want to win, but either horse that wins seems to shake out poorly for Westerners. They're like, oh, if Israel wins, then they're going to push all of the Palestinians out and resettle them in the West. And if Palestinian wins, then all the Israelis will be pushed out, and everyone's going to have to resettle in the West. Like, at no point in this conversation are our interests being looked after by anyone in this conflict, but we're placing bets on it because we think it will. But I'm like, no, hold on a second. Let's ask ourselves, what do we actually want for our survival, for our identity? And you had talked about retribalization in the broader interest of, I think you might describe it as creating a functional ethno-state. I was wondering if you'd like to talk a bit about that. I know it's a big topic, but a few videos you talked about retribalization. Would you like to speak to that a bit?
Sure, absolutely. The concept of retribalization is really, in a way, a non-political concept, because the idea is that the more things fall apart, the less people will be engaged in sort of trying to influence the wider politics of what's going to happen with the foreign policy and so on. People will start looking after themselves, and they will sort of group into these cultural units. And I've sort of compared it with free churches or these kinds of smaller religious communities that exist. I know it's different between America and Europe. In Europe, in Scandinavia, for example, you have the state church, which is where most people go, and then you have like the free churches. You have the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have the Mormons, you have the Baptists, you have all kinds of other kinds of groups. And they celebrate their holidays together. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses don't celebrate holidays, but these different communities, they work together as a living community. But they are non-political in the sense that they do not pose a threat to the state. They do not challenge the state's power in any way. The religious community is more of a day-to-day community for the individuals, and it doesn't look to change the outside world in any way. And so I think that rather than trying to change what's going on in overall society, more and more people will see that is going to be pretty difficult for the foreseeable future. I think that perhaps on a larger scale, and I've often talked about this in terms of when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, it took 3-4 centuries for that to happen. And it's something like that we're looking at. Maybe not, several centuries, but definitely several generations. This is not a quick fix situation that we're in, because we're in a very deep civilizational and cultural crisis in the West, and it's going to take at least a couple of generations to turn things around in any big way for all of society. And during that time, I think that people will start more and more to just group into these perhaps religious communities, perhaps other kinds of communities, and just sort of looking out for themselves. And I think it's important to emphasize that I'm not talking about any kind of, weird sectarian things like, Waco or anything like that, where you just isolate yourself on a compound. I'm talking about a very natural way of living in, for example, a religious community. I mean, if you are a Mormon, for example, well, you live your life in a normal way. You don't, it's not all that sectarian, maybe, or Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever. I'm just using those reference points to sort of make to clarify what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about, to some sort of doomsday cult or something like that. I'm talking about normal living social religious communities that people will automatically gravitate towards, because they realize that, well, There's very little we can do about the overall situation in the short term. So we're just going to have to, network with each other and help each other out. And I think also in terms of how, when society is collapsing more, social functions in terms of, the state taking care of problems for you and so on, it's not going to work because it's already collapsing. The economy is collapsing. The law enforcement is collapsing more and more. So I think people are going to become more and more self-reliant in a very organic way, and they're going to sort of bond together in either tight communities or loosely connected communities. And what I said in the speech I gave about retribalization is that that's probably going to be, there's going to be different levels of intensity for these kinds of communities. You see today, Jews, for example, some Jews they dress in normal clothes and they are sort of liberal Jews, but they are still part of the Jewish community. Other Jews are Orthodox Jews, or they wear these hats and the black clothes, and you can see very clearly that they are distinguished by clothing. Other groups like the Amish, they dress in a very different way and they live in a completely isolated area. That's probably also going to happen for some people. My point is that there are different degrees of separation from overall society, where probably most people will just, not be separated from society, but they will still have their community for finding a spouse, for finding work, for celebrating holidays together, and for doing other things together like that, social functions. But they will still, live very much and be a part of, and that's what I would prefer, live and be a part of the overall society, and abandon the sort of pipe dream of changing, in a dramatic way, changing how society works.
That's a very interesting model. I would say that Jews are probably the most advanced form of that sort of tribalization process. I think a lower resolution, but still highly effective model would be the caste system. And when I was reading about the dynamics of China infiltrating Canada, one thing they'd mentioned was in a lot of these in China, your extended kinship network is based on your familial connections, and their family networks would seem very alien to a Western individualized mind. But they said it was to the point where, for a lot of these new immigrants, sometimes criminals, sometimes not, they could expect to step off of the plane in Vancouver, look around, find a bar, literally a bar with their last name on it, and go in and immediately have connections there because like their kinship network operated their own sort of bars and safe houses and whatnot. And you can just look for your name on a building, walk in there. It'll be like a little kind of dive, but it's like, here's your base of operations in a new land, which could never be experienced by any white Westerner, like going to China and expecting to find like a little base of operations for you there, or what you might see in India. And that sort of network is very strange to us. And I think what's interesting moving forward is going to be, as we retribalize, which I think is inevitable, and it's something that we're doing in our political milieu, it's how that can take on a distinctly European character, and not just because some people on our side, especially on the dissident right, the far right, we have a tendency to look to other cultures. Islam would be an example, and saying, "I like what they're doing. Let's be like them." And oftentimes, a lot of the more collectivist people on our side, the ones who are more friendly to like Marxism and whatnot, they'll look to China and say, wouldn't it be great if we could be a hive mind like them, but in Europe? And I just don't think that like the Eastern mind, you can just take their infrastructure and drop it over us, just like we can't take our models and drop it over there and expect it to work. So I'm interested to see what we can do that will be unique to us. And one example might be, we discussed this on the show a couple of weeks ago. There's this book called The Network State. It was written by an Indian guy, oddly enough. So as a result, his name escapes me, but it's a very complicated Indian name. Anyway, it's an interesting book. It's kind of a technocratic book, sort of like a neo-reactionary type book, but it's saying like, look, okay, and it's very sort of liberal in its mindset at the same time, because it's like, okay, but if you want to create a parallel society, step away from society, you can use technology to do that. Okay, how does that make sense? And he's using the model of like social networks and blockchain technology to, but step by step, saying that, look, you build a community online, you use that to crowdfund actual land purchases. You buy some land so that your community, which could be decentralized geographically, can still like become real in some way. And as you gain members, you kind of create this sort of constitution. It's basically about forming an affinity network. Now he would do it in more of an ideological sense or an anti-woke sense, because a lot of them are just like, oh, I'm anti-woke. But you could easily layer an ethnic dimension to that easily. But while that might not be the perfect model, that represented one. I'm like, okay, I'm looking at that and I'm seeing something that could be workable in Europe and the West. It's not just a rigid caste system. It's encouraging people to start now. How do you start with something? How do you start retribalizing per se? And there's a model. And now, what do you think about that? Do you think that our retribalization process will need to look like something new, or do you look more towards the past and say we should just reach back into history and use that model?
Yeah, I definitely recognize what you're saying there, that a lot of people who are, they're just fed up with what's going on in society. So they just want something dramatically different and so on. And so they go into these kind of, this dramatic rhetoric or unrealistic rhetoric about white Sharia and like all these kinds of bizarre things, which I don't think works because it doesn't appeal to our kind of people. I mean, people are different ethnic groups or different races, different peoples have different mentalities, and there is a certain type of society and a certain type of community that appeals to our mentality. And so I definitely think that we can't just copy something that works for Muslims, for example, because they're completely different. They have a different mentality. So we would have to build it along the lines of something that actually typically works in Western societies. And you're in Canada, I'm Scandinavian. I think we have a very similar culture in many respects. And so I think probably you also have these kinds of religious communities of completely average, normal, white, liberal people, and so on, right? And so I think those kinds of communities that already work for white people, for our group, that already appeal to and work for our kind of people, I think that's the natural thing to take inspiration from, rather than trying to copy something exotic just because it looks cool on a picture or something like that. I just don't think that works. I mean, I'm a very liberal-minded kind of person myself. I mean, I don't want to impose myself on others and tell others what to do and so on. I'm very free-spirited in that sense. So I think just a normal European style of community building is what works. And one thing that has been a game changer in many ways is, of course, social media and the metaverse, or sort of the online world. Because while there's a lot to be critical of with regard to the internet, and people spending more and more time on the internet more than is healthy, and I'm definitely perhaps more critical of that than anyone else is. It's important to acknowledge that there's also an upside to it, because already we are living in communities. I mean, just by spending a lot of time in communities online and in social media and talking to our friends. I mean, I'm talking to you right now. Most of our people probably spend most of their waking hours communicating mostly with like-minded people, even if they don't live with, have them as neighbor. They talk to them online, and so they've already built a community. Of course, the challenge is, or the next step is, to live close enough so that it actually becomes a real community as well, so that you can help each other out with finding work or finding a spouse, or help each other out in everyday situations. I mean, one of the things that I'm very fond of, and my own intellectual background is sociobiology. E.O. Wilson and people like that, who talked a lot about how we are hardwired to be social creatures. This kind of extreme individualism, ideological individualism, is a little bit contrived. I think we depend on other people, and we have to have a real physical community around us just to help us with everyday functions, especially when the sort of overall society is, I'm not going to exaggerate and say that it's collapsing, but it's definitely not working well anymore. I mean, if you compare today with 20 or 30 years ago, law enforcement, just the economic situation, and how things work in your everyday experience of just living in this society, I think has deteriorated significantly. And a lot of people just don't trust that society can take care of their problems and their needs anymore. So they're going to have to, it's going to be automatic that they're going to sort of bond together in these communities. But like I said, I think it's important to emphasize that I'm not talking about any sort of weird sort of cult environment like Charles Manson or suicide cult or anything. I'm talking about a very organic, normal, laid back community, but it's just something that where we can feel at home. And I just think that that's going to happen automatically. It's not something that you even have to push. It's more a prediction than a prescription almost. Well, but I do advocate it. I do think it's a good thing.
No, I agree. And you can always tell when things are starting to go wrong in society when even the liberals are starting to complain about it. And you see that in America, if you read the news, and especially in Canada, where they're beginning to admit that their policies have gone horribly wrong. Now they will assess it incorrectly and blame the wrong thing. But even in Canada, they're starting to say, like, there's a lot of Indians here and they all came here over the past 3 years, and this is unsustainable. And you're hearing this from the liberals, which by global standards are far more progressive than the Democrats in the U.S. even. So, but we also say that if a liberal is complaining about something, it's almost too late to correct the ship. That's why I think not only are can they not correct the ship, they can address what the real problem is. And so they'll never come up with a solution. And I was actually thinking about this earlier today, how amusing it is that, if you confront a lot of them with the problems, they will, first of all, straight up deny that there's a problem. And once they acknowledge there's a problem, they'll find a way to blame the West or blame white people. Like, why are there so many Indians here that driving up the house prices? Well, it's that's not happening. Well, it is. Well, it's in a way, it's our fault that's happening. It's like, just, you're never going to come up with a solution with that. But on our side and the dissident side, we seem to be the only ones who are at least trying to craft some kind of solution, and this would be one of them. However, one interesting aspect that I encourage people to think about is, you had mentioned not turning into a personality cult of any kind. I would agree, but I think that's something we need to watch out for as we do this. As you start, retribalizing online, locally, wherever it might be, finding your people, building these affinity networks, be aware that there's a lot of kooky characters out there. There's a lot of antisocial personalities that find their way into these spaces that might be trying to seek refuge in these communities, and they might not have the best interests in mind. And antisocial and insane people have a tendency to rise up through the ranks, even though you don't think they would. And there's one thing I know we actually have to get going soon, but on one of your videos, it was on the topic of retribalization. You had mentioned that the importance of a founding myth. And I think we sort of got into that with the religion and the spirituality. But I'm curious, because you've thought quite a bit about this, and I think this is something you're trying to live as close as you can to. What would your founding myth be in your ideal retribalized little society? I know that's a big question, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, that is a big issue. I think that all organic founding myths are is a narrative, a story about common ancestry. I think that is why. Ethnic communities and so on. That's why, I mean, our religions used to be ethnic communities. Different peoples worshipped different gods. Those gods might, if you agree with, for example, the perennialist school or the capital T traditionalist school, those gods would, behind the scenes would represent the same thing, but different tribes would talk about them in different ways because it was their tribal god. And very often they would trace their origin to a sort of a mythological beginning. They would trace their kings or their leaders, their chieftains or whatever, to a mythological beginning. They would trace their own tribe to a common ancestry. I think that is one of the things that is central. And myth is, it's important to emphasize here that myth is not, I mean, in everyday conversation, myth is often used to mean something that is false. That's just a myth. That means it's a lie. It's not true. But in this context, a myth is simply a story which has a sort of a moral point, or create a story that creates a moral framework, or a story that gives meaning to your existence. Or, I mean, a religious myth isn't necessarily true or false in the sort of scientific philosophical sense, but it can provide a framework of meaning around our lives. Our lives are very chaotic. So, in that sense, I think founding myths will go back to traditional European roots of our philosophy, our mythology. I don't think that you can really create them. I mean, I don't think that this is something that you can sit down like you sort of write a film, or like L. Ron Hubbard. He tried to create his own religion. I guess he succeeded, to some extent at least. He's a fiction writer, and he sort of, well, I'm going to create this religion. Usually that doesn't work all that well. So I don't think this is something that we can sort of dream up or cook up here together. But I think that is sort of a general description, is that it will, because people care about who they are, people care about where they come from, and especially when people get older, they want to go and sort of research their family tree and so on. They were going to research relatives. Well, who were my relatives 10 generations, 15 generations back, and so on. And in a general way, people becoming more aware of their roots, of their ancestry, of their common ancestry, of the struggle. I mean, common struggle is extremely powerful. If you have if you have a friend, and you and your friend, you ended up in a fight somewhere, if you were growing up when you were a teenager or something, and someone else attacked you and you ended up in a fight. Maybe younger people don't do that anymore, but that used to happen in normal society in the past, that people ended up in fights. But when you go through that situation together, that sort of strengthens the bond between you. And I think in a general way, when countries have gone through war together, that really creates a sort of a glue that keeps them together, because they have gone through a very difficult experience, and that a lot of people who share that experience feel that it defines them. And so common ancestry, common religious roots, and so, religious sensibilities are very often hardwired in sort of what appeals to us as people. Different things appeal to a Scandinavian versus someone from sub-Saharan Africa, because we're just different. And so just a different expression of the religious spiritual truths, common ancestry, common struggles, those would be sort of big elements in founding myths of our community.
Now, when I was watching your video, a thought had occurred to me, because it got me thinking about the mythologization process. And I'd actually been thinking about it in terms of Christianity. I know you're not a big fan of Christianity, as far as I know, but one interesting aspect of Christianity was that its mythologization process wasn't really locked into the distant past. It's very tied temporally to like the one figure of Christ that existed in like a history, right? So it doesn't exist in sort of this. A lot of, not all civilizations, but some civilizations, their founding myth or mythology goes so far into the past, it might as well be in the ether. And was thinking about the Jews as well, that a lot of the founding myths of the Jews have to do with their own persecution, again, locked in history with various empires and even right up into the Holocaust as they see it. So I started to think of the process of mythologization. You just mentioned there, even Scientology. I'm like, Scientology is kind of a wild example, but to us, because look at all the history of Scientology, but I'm like, give it another century. What Scientology turns into might be approaching something like a more dignified form, and it could have its own its own founding mythology, in a sense, sort of locked in the past as well. But I started thinking that, could we, as we start to retribalize, as we start to build up these communities, and we will obviously center our ethnic, religious past, but I wonder if there's a way to incorporate the current historical trends into that mythology. Like, for example, like you would have as the part of history that we always call back to, let's just call it like the woke process, but the what we know as woke is really just the latest iteration of this sort of dysgenic force that is just always rising up as a cancer to destroy society. Because that's really what woke is. It's just like antisocial, dysgenic, destructive behavior. What Edward Dutton might call the spiteful mutants, just manifested with a different name. So I always think that, during our process of retribalization, we would almost need to put a pin in that and always call back to this. Like, once we make it out of this wilderness, we always got to remember what the wilderness was. We got to remember what happened when we actually let the dysgenic forces really accumulate their power, and all the insane shit that they did, all the wretchedness that they brought to bear. Because I would be horrified if we just forgot about this phase in history, the thing that drove us to do what we're doing now. I always like to think of what will happen when we win, which seems to be inevitable. I do think we'll win, but like, when we win, remember what drove us to this place, and let's really lock that in, kind of like the Jews do. Like, don't forget what happened when we released our hand off the wheel for 5 minutes. We almost lost everything. We let the droves of rapists in, and everyone thought it was cool. That's the craziest thing. How did that happen? But I think that's just the mythologization process that I find interesting. And before we leave, did you have any thoughts on that and that thing I just said?
No, absolutely. You made many important and great points. I mean, with Christianity, Christianity today is often seen as, well, Christianity is the conservative movement. It's the old-fashioned movement, and it's the sort of the traditional movement. That's not how it started. It started as a very revolutionary movement, a new truth that was spread around the world, with a Messiah that was here and started counting time from scratch again. That's how revolutionary it was. And with of course, the character of Christianity changed over time, but it was very much focused on the end of the world is here in our generation. It's going to come soon. You better, pull yourself together so you end up on the right side, and so on. Struggle between good and evil. It's a very dramatic movement back then, a very revolutionary movement, like you said, with the mythological event very close in time. And so it's kind of changed character now. With the Jews, absolutely. There's a reason why the Holocaust story is so important to the Jews, because it creates and defines their identity. And, a few years ago, it was popular for the Jews to kind of, with the survivors now that they're getting old and sort of dying off, that they're going to educate and raise a new generation of quote unquote survivors to carry on the torch. It's sort of like a new priesthood almost that's going to carry on the founding myth of who they are and what defines them, and the difficulties and the challenges they went through together. Jews are extremely good at telling these stories and creating this narrative. I mean, there's a reason why they're very influential in Hollywood, because they're very good at telling moral stories that people, are captured by, that capture people's emotions. In Hungary, for example, Hungary in 1956, um, the Hungarians trying to rebel against the Soviet Union, against Soviet occupation, and there were battles. And if you go to Hungary today, you'll see in the buildings around the parliament, you'll see the bullet holes are sort of highlighted so that everyone can go and look at the bullet holes from that battle in 1956, and it's sort of commemorated in their as a national holiday today, because it is sort of a part of their founding myth in who they are today, their fight against the communist oppression. And finally they threw off that yoke. And I think that is often also why Hungarians are so reluctant to accept any new type of quote unquote communism, a new type of this kind of totalitarian utopian society that's going to oppress them, because they went through that founding myth, they went through that experience. On a far more negative note, for example, in Norway, the Norway is a pretty new state as such, as a separate state, separate from Sweden and Denmark. So it's a young independent state, and one of the founding myths of Norway today is the experience of the German occupation during the Second World War. And people sort of lie to themselves about it and sort of exaggerate its importance in the sense that they sort of portray it as this horrific thing that everyone was against, whereas it was probably a third was very much against, a third of the population was very much was in favor, and a third was maybe neutral. But my point is that they kind of exaggerated the importance of this event, and I think that is also, the Second World War is the founding myth of the world we live in today, which is also why we accept the degradation of our countries and so on, because the story of the Second World War is the founding myth of the society we live in today. And so, absolutely, these, and it goes without saying that the Second World War was a trauma that everyone experienced. And, if you're our age now, then maybe your grandparents lived through it. So it's not all that long ago. 60 million people died. 60 million. It's a number that is can't even be grasped by the human mind. That's how many people died. So, of course, it's a global trauma, and so it served as a very effective founding myth to be sort of propagandized by the entertainment industry and so on, and exploited. So, I mean, yeah, all of what you said is true, and I think that going forward in the future, this era of extreme oppression and these trials that we're going through now, with society collapsing around us, with all the insanity, even COVID. I mean, COVID has sort of become almost as a founding myth of, well, people can relate to each other by experiencing these sort of 2 years of complete insanity when society was shut down. So these kinds of difficult periods and difficult experiences that we share, I think they're going to be elements of our founding myth going forward.
Now, Mr. Midjord, I think that is the best place to end it, because I think that covers everything I wanted to cover. And if there's nothing else you wanted to get down, I wanted to just remind everyone to check out Guide to Culture at guidingthestorm.com. And be sure to check out one of my favorite attractions, the Decameron Film Festival, where he meets with a whole cavalcade of people that you're probably familiar with to discuss movies, one of my favorite pastimes. And there you can find recordings of all of his events, the most recent one from 2023, a lot of great speakers speaking on a lot of the issues that we discussed during this episode. And be sure to check out the weekly roundup with Mark Weber, another individual that I'm deeply interested in. Every week, and discussing geopolitical events, much like we discussed today. And with that in mind, if there's anything I had missed, let me know. But I also wanted to just thank you for taking the time to sit down with me today.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. When we're recording this, it's 2 days before Christmas. Christmas Eve, I'm going to be on Millennial. So if you want to hear more from me, you can listen then. And yeah, just have a nice new year. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Fantastic. I hope to talk to you soon.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.